really excited for today's conversation. I'd like to invite all of you to put your name, your company, your location in the chat. It's a great way for everyone to know that you're here. A little bit about FamTech. We're a group of about 200 members, 175 companies that are really focused on building solutions for caregivers across the care economy. And so you can think FemTech, parent tech, baby kid tech, age tech. So first breath to last breath and everything in between. And we have Lauren Dai, our amazing entrepreneur in residence here, really giving back to this community with creating these opportunities to learn from industry professionals, from people who've been there, done that, and just super grateful for the work that Lauren has been doing. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Anna. Gosh, 1 a.m. return flight and all the travel you've been doing. It's amazing. I have experienced the travel circuit before. It is by no means easy on the body nor the brain. All right. Well, good to see everyone. I'm actually really looking forward to this session because I feel like a lot of our sessions have been very much kind of high level, and we've heard quite a bit of feedback from you all about getting quite tactical on some of the skills that you all want, especially in the sales world. And so based on some of that feedback, we're really going to focus on that hands-on kind of workshopping on the sales side today. But quickly, as Anna mentioned, I'm our entrepreneur in residence, co-founder of Cocoon. And so my experience really is in founder-led sales and scaling go-to-market from 0 to millions. So that's really what this is all about, is how to help you all kind of go through a similar motion and share those lessons back to this community. It's been amazing for me. Really quickly, as a reminder, you all kind of know this because you've been on these conversations before. Please, please, please feel free to just raise your Zoom hand or drop questions in the chat throughout. We will have some dedicated time for Q&A before we go into the breakout. But again, just really want to encourage everyone to be conversational on this front, especially since we have a more intimate group today. Okay, so just to help us ground ourselves in where we were and where we're going to be focused on for today, for those of you who've been with us for this series for several sessions, you'll remember that we started week 2 talking about developing a point of view around who your early adopter customer is and what your wedge into the market is based on doing user interviews. Week 3, we had a very kind of high level conversation around how do you start doing sales as a founder with the amazing Julie Insinger, co-founder of Carrot. And what we heard from you all is we want way, way more on that. Like we want to go way deeper in terms of, okay, we know that founder-led sales is important, but how do I actually do it? What materials do I use? What are the tips? What are mistakes I should be aware of, right? That's really what today is focused on. All right, so on that note, we're going to spend about 15 minutes just walking through a case example of early founder-led sales that I did with Cocoon. And really the goal here is just to give you kind of like a concrete example to wrap your brain around in terms of techniques around founder-led sales. So we'll talk about a couple of key tips on that front. We'll save some time for Q&A, and then we'll spend a good amount of time actually just doing a quick breakout session where we'll have some more time to actually workshop some of the content that we've talked about in this conversation. Then we'll debrief and regroup from there. Sound good? All righty. Okay, so let's just quickly recap where we were when we talked about user interviews. I know this was a couple of weeks ago, but as a reminder, before you start doing sales, you really want to have done user interviews and have a strong opinion and point of view on who your early adopter customer is. Because if you're selling into the wrong early adopter, you're going to really be banging your head against the wall. So checkpoint in terms of how do I know I'm ready to do sales? There's really 3 things. One is you should have a strong point of view on what is your wedge? So specifically, what is that really specific problem that gets your buyer excited, right? So as an example for Cocoon, That wedge in the early days was actually this idea that you could get your income from these different income sources around insurance and so forth more easily than you typically would. Second piece is you should have a strong point of view on your early adopter ideal customer profile, meaning you should know, is your early adopter, for example, a mid-market tech company? Is it healthcare? Is it a self-insured employer versus a fully insured employer? Who is really, really going to be kind of like that first buyer of yours? Because that is where you're going to be focusing your sales conversations on in order to be effective. And then the third piece is really recommend that you should have gotten early feedback on a high fidelity prototype of your actual offering or product by now before beginning sales. Reason being, you're going to really have a really hard time knowing the first two things unless you've gotten some feedback on the actual product. Does not mean you should have deployed any code or built the product yet, but you should have already gotten feedback on the product before starting to do sales. Okay, so let's keep going. And please, please, again, feel free to ask questions throughout. All right, one bonus is one thing I actually really recommend doing before you start kind of doing sales is leveraging your user interviews to get some pretty kick-ass quotes from people about what you're up to and what you're building. Because as a startup founder, you don't really have anything in terms of credibility. You have no product yet, usually. You have no customers yet, right? And so you want to start kind of like manufacturing a degree of credibility and interest. And one way to do that is actually just to pull quotes from your user interviews about these aha moments that your buyer, a potential buyer, had about your product, right? So, as an example, one of my favorite quotes from the early days in our user interviews was when we interviewed my then head of benefits at Stripe. And she said, literally this quote, "A part of me died inside. You just did in 45 seconds what takes me 2 hours to explain." And that is pretty gem, right? That's like a very gem quote to be using and putting on your website when you have no customers yet. So huge thank you, Lindsay, for giving us that quote. But really encourage you all as a bonus to look for that before kind of embarking on your first sales. Okay, so let's dive into the tool for today, which is at the end of the day, you want to develop your founder-led sales playbook. Good question, Anna. Yes, always, always ask for permission to use a quote. You want to make sure that you're getting the right permissions. And of course, these relationships are super, super key. So make sure you're building that. And eventually, oftentimes they become customers. So Lindsay became a customer of ours at Figma. All right, so back to the tool. The piece that we're focused on for today is how do you develop your own founder-led sales playbook, right? Because you are going to be the first salesperson for your company as the founder or founders. And the thing that I always want to emphasize in these conversations, which I don't think I fully realized until actually doing sales myself, is that sales is not just charisma. It is extremely systematic. And in order to win, you have to be very systematic. I know that can be non-intuitive because when we think about salespeople in movies and things like that, it just seems like they're all charisma and it's like always be selling and all of that. But at the end of the day, sales in a lot of ways is a science and a science that needs to be learned. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And you can see that using the science analogy, there are stages in sales, right? So you want to think about your playbook in stages, such as first stage might be a stage in which you're focused on discovering what the need is of the buyer. What is their timeline? Do they have budget, for example? Future stages leading up to things like involving other stakeholders who are decision makers or influencers in the decision to buy your product or your service. And then the stuff that usually folks think of like negotiating pricing, signing a contract, etc., that actually comes much later, is kind of the easier part, so to speak, relative to all of that work that needs to be done up front. So we'll talk about, I know this looks really complicated, this kind of example playbook, but what I want to do is talk about a more simple kind of example of a founder-led sales process. So we'll use Cocoon as an example and start with something that is very simple, which is how do you put together just the most basic process for yourself as a founder when you're approaching sales conversations for the first time? And just so that folks have a little bit of context, when we were starting out in doing our first sales, we were reaching out to mid-market tech companies. So again, we had reached those checkpoints, right? We had identified our early adopter, which were mid-market tech companies, the likes of Benchling, who you heard from Vivek a few weeks ago, for instance. And we knew what our wedge in was, this magic of getting access to income more easily. And we also knew in terms of we also had some background in terms of, okay, great. Who's the persona on the other end, like a head of total rewards or benefits, right? Before starting sales. So our early kind of sales process looked something like this. It was fairly simple, would typically involve, call it 4 stages before actually signing a contract. And this is quite common for kind of like a mid-market sales cycle where you have maybe something in the range of like 3 to 4 stages in the sales process. And one thing I want to emphasize is a stage does not mean a call, meaning you could stay in the stage for many, many calls if you don't exit that stage, right? So like you could be in discovery for 3 calls if you haven't figured out who the people involved in the decision is. Just want to make sure that that's really clear. So this is a really kind of like good canonical example of a simple sales process where you start out by having a conversation with your target buyer, right? In our case, it would be a head of benefits or a head of total rewards who is often called the user buyer, the person that's actually going to be day-to-day using your product, right? And we're going to learn from them, do you have a need? Like, is managing leave in the case of Cocoon a really, really challenging problem for you that you want to change how you approach it today? You want to figure out who's involved in the decision, right? In terms of who can sign off on budget, who can actually sign off and say, yes, we are moving forward with your product. You want to know their timeline, right? So like, when do they expect to go live with you as a partner? And ideally, especially because these are kind of early sales conversations, you want to have a little bit of something to kind of get them excited and interested, right? To have further conversations. So typically what I recommend at this stage is like a quick teaser demo with your prototype. Again, I highly recommend not building anything until you've had your first, call it 1 to 2 sales. Because at the end of the day, you want that confirmation of market pull before you really deploy resources on building. Okay, so then let's talk about the next kind of stages. So once you've discovered their needs and people involved in timeline, then you want to make sure you've touched all the people. Because the last thing you want is that you think you're getting really far along in this conversation, they're really interested and leaning in, gets to the last stage, and they're like, oh no, sorry, our finance director or our payroll team or our chief people officer thought it was a bad idea. Not a fit, not a need, right? Not a priority right now. Bye. Then it's like, oh no, we just spent all this time cultivating this conversation with one persona only to be then have that go to waste because we didn't touch the other stakeholders, right? So really, really important in that second stage to make sure you have touched the stakeholders and make sure those stakeholders, including key decision makers, are on board and being guided towards the ultimate outcome of like, yes, this is something we want to bring into our company. Make sense? And then the next stage in this kind of simple founder-led sales process is what I call validating fit. So here, you really want to make sure that your buyer goes from, hey, I am interested to like, I really get it and I really get the value of this, right? And that involves also embracing your pricing. So by this stage, you should have shared pricing and you should also have your buyer should really have a good sense of, hey, I understand why this price makes sense, what value I'm going to get from it, and the return on my investment by paying this money for this solution, right? So not only that, but your decision makers, the other stakeholders, like let's say you need approval from a chief HR officer, chief people officer, finance, they should also understand the ROI. Because if they don't, then they're not going to ultimately sign off. And we can certainly talk more about this in the Q&A in terms of like, how do you do that? What are techniques to do that? And so forth. And then finally, this is the part that people talk about all the time in sales, but really is actually just a small part of it, is then negotiating and contracting. So then yay, hopefully post negotiating your pricing, get your contract signed. Really, really important is to confirm your go live date. And there's a bunch of stuff in the post sales world that we don't have time to talk about today, but are really important, like implementation, making sure that goes well, you have a clear timeline, all of that, in order to make sure your first successful customer gets launched and is happy with you. So I know that was a very lightning kind of overview of a simple founder-led sales process, but I think hopefully this is helpful as far as just giving you a sense of like, what does a typical sales process look like at the early stage when you're doing this yourself as a founder? Okay, so yes, thank you, Meredith. I do think this the post-contract signing period is a really important one because as many of you know, implementation is actually the first real experience that your customer has with you. And if the implementation does not go well, it's not smooth, they're going to really start off on a bad footing. And you don't want that to happen because you want it to be very well thought out such that the first kind of experience with you, that first impression is really strong. Okay, so let's go into a couple tips. I'm going to focus these tips on the discovery portion of the conversation because, in my view, this is actually the most important stage. If you don't get this stage right, nothing else matters because the reality is if you don't get enough need or the right people on the line, it's not going to convert. Urgency, timeline, you don't have that, it's not going to move to the next stage, meaning they're not going to prioritize it and you're not going to get the next conversation. So let's focus on that critical discovery conversation. I'm kind of showing here an example of an email recap from a discovery conversation I had with our very first customer. And the first tip around discovery is that you really want to focus on understanding deeply and precisely what their needs are, meaning like what are your top priorities over the next, call it 6 to 12 months, and how they tie to your solution. So you can see in this example that this company has 3 really key priorities. Now, a lot of times the mistake that we make as founders doing sales for the first time, let's say, is we spend all this time talking about ourselves, like talking about my product does this, my product has these features, etc. And in reality, you want to flip that. You want to be talking about them. You want to be listening to them actually, and have them spill out all of their problems to you with whatever it is the solution solves, like in the case of Cocoon, leave management. Spill out all of their problems to you and why they have so much pain here, because you need them to realize that their needs are on fire bad enough that they have to move from their status quo. Otherwise, there's not enough energy because the reality is like things are so busy. HR people are so busy. There's so many things on their plate. They may be implementing a new HRIS system, right? They may be going through a ton of hiring processes, et cetera. Why focus on your particular solution? They've got to have internalized that there's an on fire enough problem that they need to move from the status quo. So in the case of this early customer, you can see that there's some pretty on fire things here, right? It's like, how do we minimize risk of compliance gaps, right? Ooh, that's kind of spicy, right? Like that should be something that gets people's attention, right? So you want to get all of that information from them such that when it goes to scheduling the next meeting, they're like, yes, this is something I want to spend my time on and prioritize. Okay, so next tip is you really want to focus on the people, meaning who are the people involved, and you want to make sure that these people who are involved ideally are on the next call with you, right? Because oftentimes when you have the first kind of discovery conversation or discovery call with your buyer, you often just get one person, maybe, right? And that person probably is the person who's sort of like in the day to day doing whatever it is that your product is solving. So maybe in the case of leave, it's someone in benefits, total rewards, for example, who has that under their purview, right? If you're selling something in the education kind of space, maybe it's someone in L&D, for example, right? So but that person isn't the only person usually who's going to make a decision, especially at a mid-market and certainly at an enterprise company. Usually there are other people involved who are either influencers, say cross-functional partners like finance, who need to be bought in, or they're actual decision makers. So for example, the head of benefits may tell you, hey, I really like you, Cocoon or Lauren, but my chief people officer needs to approve this. They're going to be the one to sign the contract, not me, right? So if I don't get the chief people officer on the line, it's going to make it really hard for me to convince them with my, let's say head of total rewards that I'm working with, that they should be moving forward with me. So the people is really important. And you'll notice that I circled this line because you'll see that in the conversation I had with this early customer, one thing I asked them was, hey, who else needs to be involved in the decision? And they were like, you know what? We need to bring in so and so. And you can see I said, hey, I'm really looking forward to meeting so and so as well, right? Because we want to make sure that they're on the line too. So at the end of the day, it's really critical that they kind of see for themselves the value of what you're offering. Okay. And again, please feel free to chime in with questions as we go, folks. So next tip is timeline. This is really critical. All the time, I get questions from founders that are like, oh no, so-and-so that I thought was, I was working really closely with, they haven't responded in weeks. It's been weeks since I've heard from them. I thought they were really excited about our solution and what we're building. And it's like, what's going on here? Probably, oftentimes, it has to do with urgency, meaning how urgent do they actually think working with you is, right? And if you haven't helped them internalize that this is really urgent, they're probably going to put you on the back burner, right? Because there's so much going on in HR. And so what you really want to do is get really clear on what makes your solution, having your solution so urgent, right? So for example, in the case of this early customer, they were going to almost double year over year starting in 2021. And what that meant is that every problem they had was going to be just doubly hard and doubly scaled if they didn't solve it now, right? So that was really what's going to drive their urgency. So it's really important to ask questions to get at that urgency. Okay. So a very simple way to do that is just say, hey, when do you need a solution in place by, right? And have them explain, like, why is that? All right. Next tip is it's all about the next. So again, one of the things that I hear all the time from founders doing sales for the first time is like, oh no, this company who I thought was really excited about us, they ghosted me. I haven't heard from them in weeks, right? Again, you're trying to get that next meeting, and for some reason, no one's responding, and you wonder if they still care. So a quick tip here to really actually help on this front, it's really simple actually, is just save 5 minutes at the end of every conversation to always align on what's next. Make sure that you and your buyer are aligning, hey, next steps are A, B, and C. So-and-so needs to be on the call next, right? Like this decision maker. Let's actually look at calendars right now to make sure that we get that on the calendar so that we're not kind of like risking the situation where it's hard to schedule and the conversation goes dark as a result. So Again, this is such a simple thing to do, but I can't tell you how often it is not common that happens. And founders tell me, "Oh no, I've been ghosted. Like I haven't heard from this potential customer in weeks." And if anyone else has tips around that front, please feel free to chime in as well. Okay. Tip number 5 is assign homework and deadlines. This one is really non-intuitive because people think that when you're doing the selling, like let's say you're the founder, you're doing the selling, and your buyer shouldn't do any work. That is not true. In fact, if your buyer is not doing any work, then they're not bought in. They don't think this is a big enough problem because if they're not spending any time on it, then they don't have skin in the game, right? And they're not going to be spending all the effort to bring you in because it is a lot of effort on their end. It's a lot of change, a lot of stakeholder management. So assign homework and deadlines, one, because it moves the conversation forward, right? Like um, you need them to execute on things on their end, right? So for example, in an implementation, you need the buyer to agree to certain timelines, certain actions on their end. Basic stuff like signing the contract, getting it approved through their finance team, pushing it through security. Those are all things the buyer is responsible for, right? So the key tip here is in your discovery conversation, you want to make sure you get the timeline from them is when do they need to be live by, right? Based on their urgency and work backwards from that shared go live timeline to create what I often recommend doing is like a project tracker that's shared between you and your buyer. And this could be a very simple project tracker. It could literally be a Google sheet with like 5 line items that are just, hey, what do you need to do, get done by when? Who's the owner, right? So for example, get approval from finance. Like, here's the owner. This is like the due date. Go through security, SOC 2 review, right? Here's the owner and the due date and so forth. So that's really critical because one, you want to make sure you kind of like help your buyer understand the roadmap, right? Kind of like guide them through that process. And also, you want to get information from them on is there anything missing in this process, right? Maybe you have a procurement team I didn't know about that needs to be involved, right? So make sure that you actually are getting their input on that front. Okay, cool. So one tip here is if you're noticing your buyer is not doing the homework, every week they come back and they're like, oh, sorry, Lauren, I didn't have time. I was too busy. That's a pretty good sign that you actually did not discover enough need or pain, and this is not a high enough priority for them yet. And so you really should be going back to that discovery period and being like, how do I, like, why might this be actually a high priority for you that you're actually investing time now to get this across the line? Tip number 6. So this is a question I get asked all the time, which is, hey, I'm super early stage, right? I have no customers, I have no product. And I can't have the whole hog, right? Like your product is unlikely to be super comprehensive off the bat. In the case of my experience with Cocoon, for example, we were only live in 2 states when we first launched, and for only one type of leave, which was parental leave. But while you're early stage, you can still paint the picture of the journey together, right? And that's really important because a lot of times your early adopter buyer is willing to take a leap of faith and say, hey, I'm willing to trust you, startup, right? I'm willing to trust you, Maggie or Greg or Mary Beth. But I need to know that you're going to eventually meet my full needs, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to build the full stack from day one, but just show them the roadmap and your journey together, right? So for example, um, like when we launch together on Jan 1st, we're going to be live in these 2 states with this kind of leave in the case of Cocoon, right? Um, in Q2, we're going to have all 50 states, let's say. In Q3, we're going to have all the different leave types, let's say, right? So just be really clear about what your roadmap is and help your buyer kind of understand it. That is the way to solve the problem of early stage of like, I'm not there yet, but I know you have this bigger need. Okay, cool. And again, make sure your roadmap's realistic because it's hard to predict sometimes. So just be aware of that. Question from Meredith. Meredith, if you're in a place to come off mute, do you want to go ahead and ask that?
Yeah, just you were talking about your roadmap and you gave your example of Cocoon's roadmap to share with potential clients, but I would love to learn more about your thoughts on developing that actual roadmap that you eventually share.
Yeah, great question. So, one of the things you want to look for in an early adopter is willingness to do almost like a design partnership on roadmap, where for them, you're actually looking for them to be sort of like a canonical example of future customers and for them to essentially be shaped like your future customers such that their needs are essentially what your future customers want, right? So in the case of our early customers, like a benchling, for example, you all met Vivek, right? A few weeks ago. A lot of them were only in one or two states at the time, like California. So their needs were fairly narrow, but they knew that they were going to be expanding into many, many more states. And part of the reason was because of COVID, right? Where a lot of folks were getting distributed. But they knew, hey, we're okay with starting with California, Lauren, but we need you to be in all these states, right? It's like, okay, then that's when we go back to our sort of product conversations and say, okay, when can we be in all these states by, right? So it's really about listening to those early customers in terms of making sure one that they're kind of like canonical examples of who your early adopter customer would be, right? Because you don't be building something that's not what everyone else wants. So like again, don't build like custom stuff in this case, right? But you want to be listening to them for their needs. So they might tell you things like, hey, in addition to parental leave, this isn't a big need for me yet, but I have a need for a medical leave because we're seeing more and more usage of medical leave around mental health needs, et cetera, right? So you want to be listening for that and have that help you shape the roadmap, but make sure that that is aligned with what you've heard from other examples of similar types of early adopters because you don't want to be building custom stuff necessarily. You want, at the end of the day, to build a sustainable business, you need to have a product that can address a meaningful market.
Lauren, can I add a little experience nugget there? Um, we would have a very similar dynamic, early adopter, and they would say you start listening for these keywords. It would be great if your product did XYZ. I really wish, and always be listening for those little nuggets of, okay, that should go on my roadmap. But um, you have two actions when you hear those phrases. One is um, put it in the freezer, I call it. And then to Lauren's point, if you start hearing other customers request the same thing, it starts to thaw and it can actually make it to the roadmap. So have some discipline on resources for development that doesn't take every single thing, but it's starting to thaw. That little feature is going to come out of the freezer and actually come into development. The second action you need to take when you hear those phrases are, can I ask you something? If I were to say we can do this or this, in this instance, it would be, um, you know, uh, log in with single sign-on versus add another state for leave. Which one would you want me to prioritize? And so you're getting a priority insight, like, okay, I'm starting to hear that you want the feature, and I know how important it is to you compared to the other things I have in my freezer. And the
Love that
discovery.
freezer thawing analogy, Anna.
Exactly. And it's really hard to go to market with an imperfect product. And you just have to get there good enough and take a lot of deep breaths when you know your product could be better because you do have to put things in the freezer to stay alive long enough to get a chance at thawing a few.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so put another way, make note of every feature request, so to speak, that you get, and don't immediately say yes because you need to know what the most frequent and most top priority asks are. And you probably want to have more than one conversation around that to get some more data points there. Great question. Okay, so a couple of questions in the chat. One from Legia, if you want to come off mute real quick.
Hey there. So yeah, the question is if you're selling to HR, do you have any tips or ideas about how to identify HR buyers? They can be really tough to get to.
Yes. Okay. So one tip, definitely check out our Selling into HR session for sure. The recordings on our FamTech YouTube channel. But just really quick thought here. It all depends on who in HR you're selling to, meaning, for example, like what segment you're selling to. So for instance, tech HR buyers who are mid-market hang out in a completely different spot than the HR leaders at Starbucks. They're just like a totally different market, right? So if you're selling in the tech HR, you might want to be going to conferences like Transform that Anna, Stephanie, and team were at recently. If you're selling in an enterprise, you want to be going a completely different route. You might want to be going through brokers, for example, right? So like you might want to go to other types of conferences, like conference, I think there's a conference called Conference Board, for example. So just the thing to be aware of is like where your buyer hangs out is going to be wildly different depending on type of segment they are and their actual title.
That totally makes sense. If I can just follow up real quick, I'm still trying to figure out exactly who my best buyer is. And I know that ideally you choose the buyer, you see the need, then you build the product. But what if you thought you had a buyer, you started building a product and realized it was different, and then you're trying to figure out, you're in the situation where you're like, I'm not sure if the buyer is XYZ. Do you recommend just kind of like shooting out to a bunch, like a few in each category and
Yeah, great
things like that?
question. So on this one, this is really taking us back to user interviews. So maybe Takia can send the user interview session in the chat. Check out that recording. But the really short answer is go wide before you go narrow, because you don't know who your customer is
Right.
until you've gone wide. So meaning you want to kind of talk to enterprise, mid-market, SMB, different industries before you start narrowing down. I think the best fit is my early adopter is going to be this.
Thanks.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, and then Arabi, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I was just curious, when your buyer is a very different stakeholder in the ecosystem compared to who the actual user is. So obviously there is an extra step involved where in a way you're selling to the user and really testing with the user before you even approach or can convincingly approach a potential buyer that is in the insurance space, let's say. How would you do this type of selling approach that you mentioned, where it's a bit of a relationship building, but in this case, it's almost like you have to first validate everything with the user and then approach another sales cycle, which is more with the ultimate buyer or the payer?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're referring to, which is actually very common in our FamTech space. Oftentimes you may hear Anna Stephanie kind of calls it the B2B2C model, right? Where let's say your the kind of end community you want to help is, let's say, parents, right? But you're selling through HR in order to help them. Or the end community you want to help is the elderly, right? But you need to sell through some kind of healthcare insurance entity in order to help the elderly. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yeah, so it's almost like you're selling to multiple stakeholders in the system. So there's a patient, and then there's the physician involved, and then there is also the ultimate insurance, who's often, at least in healthcare, the buyer, even though they're not the ones who are ever going to be using the product.
Yeah. This is very, very common. One quick recommendation is if you haven't checked out the first session on how to think about B2B versus B2C and like B2B2C, definitely check that out on our YouTube channel. That one will kind of help give a little bit of a framework here. But really quick thought on this one is that you definitely want to be understanding the needs of both upfront. So for example, in the case of Cocoon, right? One of our end users would be, let's say, a parent or someone going on medical leave, but we need to, the way that we impact them is through the buyer, who is HR, right? And so when we were in the user interview phase, we were actually talking to both simultaneously. So we were talking to parents. We interviewed hundreds of parents, right? We also interviewed hundreds of HR people. And so you want to be able to explain to the buyer, hey, the value prop to the end user is this, but like the value prop to you, buyer, is X, right? So like in the case of just using Cocoon as an example, right? One of the value props to the end buyer related to the buyer, the HR person, related to one of the users, right? The employee, is employee attraction and retention, right? Because if they have a better experience with their leave, they're less likely to leave the company. Does that kind of help answer your question a bit?
It does. If I may, just to follow up on that, often I'm finding that it's not the value prop that's the problem. It is the evidence that's the roadblock.
I just want to add one thing. I think you're right, and I couldn't agree more with Lauren, making sure that when you are building product for a user versus selling to a buyer, that you get that messaging right. But in terms of an actual playbook in motion, there's an interesting case study with Salesforce back in the day. They, were selling, this was a new concept of CRM, that everything was antiquated before Salesforce. So they knew it was going to be hard to convince the buyer, the sales leader, unless it truly impacted revenue. And so they went to the individual sales representative and said, hey, you want to use this tool for a while? And they would do that across 10 employees at one particular organization. They would pay out of pocket for it, a small subscription fee. And then the Salesforce sales rep would take that to the sales leader and say, look, these 10 people, tell me if they're outperforming your other salespeople because they're using our software. And so there is an interesting playbook if you can get the individual employee or user purchasing and you aggregate that data for an actual B2B sale. It's difficult. You have to be deliberate in how you're capturing users and consolidating them and all of those things. But that is maybe something to consider if the value has to be proven, like you're talking about, Arabi, because it's new, it's never happened before. Is that kind of what you're describing?
It does. I think you touched on it, and I was just trying to clarify the situation where there is a burden of evidence before you can, in a way, sell. So Lauren, I was just referring to your earlier slide where you had it mapped out in terms of the timeline. When you're selling to a user and convincing them to use the product, and then you're trying to collect evidence and then ultimately selling to a payer in the healthcare situation.
I see. Yes, yes. One example you may want to check out is in that very first session of our boot camp, and we talk about B2B, B2C, and so forth. There is a case study we run through on MIDI Health, which is a really interesting example where they at some point wanted their buyer to be the employer to a certain extent. However, because the employer wasn't ready to buy at that point, there wasn't enough knowledge of, for example, aging and menopause, for instance. They actually had to start B2C. And so they had the women themselves be paying for this product. Later, they could use that information and those stories to then sell B2B. So that might be a good example to check out.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I know we're running a little bit low on time. Somehow we always get into these great conversations that last longer than I hoped for or than I allocated for, but are so good. So thank you for all the questions, folks. What I do want to do is spend some time on a quick exercise around discovery. And Takia, who is our events lead, given that we're a bit low on time, I think I'm actually going to skip the breakout. But please come back for our next session, which will have ample time for breakout and networking. And just kind of have us do this. We're a small enough group on this line today too, as well to do this exercise together. So what I want to do is do a little bit of an exercise around discovery because this is such a key process in the sales conversation. And so as a quick reminder, discovery, that's the stage in the sales conversation where you're getting the needs, people, and timeline related to your buyer. And so I just want to ask for one volunteer, if you can raise your Zoom hand and offer to participate in this exercise with me, bonus points, FamTech bonus points. And we'll just quickly go through what are you selling, what's your offering, who's the early adopter customer that you're focused on, And then let's craft together some discovery questions that can hit these buckets together. Any volunteers? Oh, looks like Greg. Greg? Yeah? Okay, perfect. All right, Greg, you want to come off mute?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't remember how to raise a hand, so figured I was on screen. Let's rock and roll.
Amazing. Okay, so Greg, tell me, what is your offering?
Sure. So I'm the founder of Petunia. We're a decision management platform for families that are discovering and deciding on assisted living or memory care for a loved one.
Okay. Very cool. I love that. And I love that you have that in your background too. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what is the profile of a buyer that you're selling into?
Yeah, so my hypothesis right now is sort of middle market, probably tech tends to be more generous with either voluntary or group benefits. So pretty similar to Cocoon.
hmm Okay. So like mid-market tech companies, probably someone similar to maybe like a Benchling who we heard from a couple
Yep.
weeks ago, where a couple hundred person tech company um, tend to be more generous on the benefits front, maybe willing to kind of pitch in on the assisted living front.
Right.
Okay, that makes total sense. Cool. All right, let's kind of go bucket by bucket. So, maybe really quickly, what kind of experience have you had with sales conversations so far? Have you would for example, if you were to have one, would that be your first ever sales conversation, or have you had some so far?
I mean, I've done a ton of customer discovery, not any actual sales calls yet for this
Okay, well,
project.
perfect. This is the perfect time for us to be kind of helping you and workshopping this together.
Yeah.
So, what is a question that you think you could ask your buyer? Let's just say that they're like someone like Vivek, right, at Benchling, about to understand their needs around assisted living.
Yeah. So, our actual customer is the family of somebody who needs assisted living.
Uh-huh.
And so that would be, typically your Gen X or elder millennial who is working at your company.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because they're the one that's often making that decision for somebody to go into assisted living or memory care. Um, so my immediate thought is to ask sort of like demographic questions, but I think that's probably illegal. Um, but I don't know that for certain. Because that would, very quickly kind of get me to a place where I could understand, out of your 500 person workforce, what percentage would even be interested or eligible in the next, say 2 to 5 years in needing or wanting to look at assisted living or memory care. Um,
Yeah, by the way, that's a totally valid question to ask. And
oh, really?
you
Oh,
should totally ask that in terms of, hey, tell me more about your team, right? Tell me more about your employees. Like how many people are you? What's the mix of different age ranges between, folks who are let's say like Gen Xers versus millennials and so forth. That's totally valid question to ask. For example, when we were in conversations with potential buyers, a lot of times we'd ask them things like, hey, like what share of your team might be parents, right? Or caregivers, for example.
mhm.
hmm
Okay.
Yeah, that actually I would even bucket into something like before needs potentially, which is like background questions, right? Folks love to talk about what their day to day is, right? So you might want to say, hey, I want to just ask you, Vic, or whoever it is, a couple of just background questions about your company first, right? To understand kind of like what your team looks like and whether there could be a fit here.
Hmm. Okay. That's helpful. Um, so then let's see. Discovery questions, I think. Good
And if
question.
anyone has an idea, feel free to raise your hand to suggest a question too, or drop a suggestion for Greg in the chat as well, because we want to help Greg craft these questions together.
So if we've got the demographics out of the way, I'd want to start uncovering pain, right? Without necessarily leading the horse, leading the
Mm-hmm.
witness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so one of the areas I like to focus on, one stat that I like to focus on is for the average family, they spend over 70 hours researching and deciding on senior living broadly, right? Which, from a value prop perspective, for me, That's, lost productivity, that's extra stress, so on and so forth. It can get into areas of, retention, that sort of thing. So I'm trying to figure out how to flip that around and turn it into a discovery question.
Yeah, maybe one suggestion for you, Greg, is I actually often like to use a very simple discovery question. It doesn't have to be quite pointed, but it could be
mm,
something as simple as, "Hey, tell me more about the caregivers in your team who are supporting elder parents. Like, what are some of the challenges they're running into?"
mm,
Does that resonate?
yep,
So then
yep,
it really gives them a chance to spill out all of what they've heard from their team members and make it more of a conversation, right? Because at the end of the day, the result you want from them is for them to be kind of spilling their heart out to you, right?
sure,
Versus you asking them like, how many employees do you have who are caregivers? And them just saying like 10 and
right,
moving on, right?
yep,
Because that doesn't generate a conversation or get you really kind of like some of that really like those gems that come out from more open-ended questions, like tell me
sure,
about this, right? And what the challenges they're experiencing are.
okay,
All right, let's move on to people, and we'll just use this as our last example since I know we're running a bit low on time. But let's say you want to get a bit more information on who's going to be involved in making a decision to work with Petunia.
yep. Yeah, I mean, I think at just asking the question, right? So it sounds like we kind of recap the pain, recap how you're going to solve the pain, right? Kind of as your soft close. And then literally asking like, hey, it sounds like you can see that there's value here. I want to make sure that I'm including everybody else that needs to understand the value of Petunia within your organization. My experience has shown typically this involves a finance person, somebody from legal, and supply chain. Does that sound right? Is there anybody else we should loop in to these early conversations? Something
Yeah,
like that?
that's great. That's spot on, Greg. And I love what you said about typically I've seen X, Y, and Z be involved. Who do you think should be involved, right?
Right.
Because that really helps kind of remind them about who the typical stakeholders are and who you're really looking forward to bringing into this conversation.
Cool.
Awesome. Okay. Let me just quickly check the chat. So, a question from Javest. Is it also helpful to ask why they haven't focused on solving the problem as of yet? Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something where you could definitely frame a question around needs there, right? Of, hey, like, why hasn't this bubbled up to something that you've tackled yet, right? Like, what's been holding you back, right? Could be a very simple question around that front.
Hmm.
That might also address timeline as well, because again, you want to understand like, hey, what would make you move on this now, right? So like asking them what's been holding them back would also give you insight into that. Great question. All right. And then I think Legia say, I'm wondering if they even know their employees are struggling because they're caregivers. They may have a pain point, but they may not know why. That's a really good point. I think oftentimes it depends on how vocal the constituency is, right? In terms of, for instance, is there a caregivers employee resource group that is talking about this problem, right? And that goes back to the user interviews of who is your early adopter, because your early adopter should be someone who's very aware of this problem. Um, and they probably should have signals like the employee resource group that is talking about, in this case for Greg Petunia, right? Senior care and assisted living. Because if they don't, you're going to have a much harder time educating them or getting any answers from your discovery question around needs. It's a really, really great point there. Okay, cool. So I know that was a lightning kind of deep dive on this workshop on sales. We could do so much more here, but in the last minute or so, I just want to get a volunteer to quickly share a takeaway of what's something that you're taking away from this conversation that you want to start doing in your next sales call. Any volunteers to
I can
share
jump
something
in.
you want to try? Yes, please, Mary Beth.
So yeah, it made me rethink kind of some of the discovery questions that I typically ask and where I can dive a little bit deeper in really harnessing the pain points.
I love that. Yeah. Don't underestimate how important discovery is and getting those pain points and needs. Spend as much time as you humanly can on that front because you're going to need it later to make sure that they convert to the next stage.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone. And we will see you next week for our final session of this series, which I'm personally very excited about on building a company and building a family at the same time. So hopefully that's something that resonates with a lot of folks in this room. All right, everyone, have a great week. Greg, you're a champ. Thank you for workshopping together with us. And thanks for all the great questions, crew.